They came to her door before sunrise, 3 men on horseback, and the one in front didn't bother to take off his hat. He looked past Elias Thompson like he wasn't there and fixed his eyes on Beatrice, a widow, 2 daughters at her skirt, not a single acre of land to her name. His voice was flat and certain the way men's voices get when they've never once been told no. 1 week. If you're not gone, we'll remove you ourselves. Beatrice didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She stood in that doorway and looked at him like he was a problem she had already decided how to solve. And behind her, Elias Thompson made a choice that would cost him everything and give him back more than he knew he'd lost. What city are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The man who came to tell her to leave arrived before the sun was fully up. Beatrice heard the horses first. She was already awake. She had been awake most of the night, listening to the silence of a house that wasn't hers, in a town she hadn't planned on. In a life that had gone so far sideways she sometimes forgot what the original shape of it had looked like. She heard the hooves on the packed dirt road, and something in her chest went tight, the way it did now whenever she heard a sound she couldn't immediately explain. That tightening had started on the day she buried her husband back in Ohio. It had never fully gone away. She rose from the narrow cot in the back room and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. Through the single window, the sky was the color of old pewter. The sun not yet visible, but its light starting to push against the dark. Clara and Cora were still asleep, curled against each other on the wider cot they shared, their dark hair tangled together. They slept the way children sleep when they are deeply tired. Not peacefully, exactly, but with the completeness of exhaustion. Clara had her thumb near her mouth, though she was 8 years old and had mostly stopped doing that. Mostly. Beatrice let them sleep and went to the front of the house. Elias was already there. He stood at the window in his shirt and trousers, boots on but unlaced, holding his coffee cup. He hadn't shaved in 2 days, and his jaw was dark with stubble. He looked at her when she came into the room, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't read. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of readiness. The look of a man who has already decided something before the situation has fully arrived. "Who is it?" she said. "Gerald Hatch," he said, "and he didn't come alone." She looked out the window. 3 horses. Gerald Hatch she recognized. She had seen him twice at the trading post, a heavy-set man with a wide mustache and the manner of someone who had never once in his life been told he was wrong. Behind him were 2 men she didn't know by name, but she recognized the type. Solid, silent, there to add weight to whatever Gerald Hatch intended to say. "What does he want?" she asked, though she already suspected. Elias set down his coffee cup with a careful, deliberate motion. "Same thing he's been wanting for the past 2 weeks," he said, "to make himself feel like he runs this valley." The knock on the door was loud. Not a question, a statement. Elias crossed the room in 4 strides and opened it. Gerald Hatch stood on the front step with his hat in his hands, not held politely, but gripped, like a man holding something he might need to use. He looked past Elias immediately, his eyes finding Beatrice where she stood near the window. His expression didn't change. That was somehow worse than if it had. "Thompson," he said. "Hatch," Elias said. His voice was level. "You're here early." "I'm here when I need to be here." Gerald Hatch's gaze moved back to Elias. "We've talked about this situation. The men on the committee have talked about this situation. I told you 2 weeks ago what needed to happen, and I'm standing here now because apparently my meaning wasn't clear." "Your meaning was clear," Elias said. "I just didn't agree with it." Gerald Hatch's jaw shifted. He looked again at Beatrice, and this time his look was slower, more deliberate, the kind of look that was meant to be felt. "Ma'am," he said. The word had no warmth in it. "I'm going to say this plainly, because I think plain is what's needed. You're a widow. You've got 2 children. You've got no husband, no family here, no claim to any land or property in this valley. This man," he gestured at Elias without looking at him, "is unmarried. He is a member of this community. The situation as it stands reflects poorly on him and on all of us. You have 1 week to make arrangements to leave. If you have not left within that time, the committee will take steps." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Beatrice felt her hands go still at her sides. She was aware distantly of the color rising in her face. Not embarrassment, not entirely. Something older and harder than embarrassment. She had stood in a lawyer's office 8 months ago, while a man in a good suit explained to her that her husband's debts had exceeded his assets and that she would need to vacate her home within 30 days. She had stood in a railroad office while a clerk told her, with genuine sympathy but no practical help, that the connecting stage had already departed and she would need to wait 3 additional days in a town with no boarding house she could afford. She had stood at the door of the church in Coloma, where Samuel Thompson had been buried 4 days before her arrival, and listened to a minister tell her, with real kindness, that there was nothing to be done, that Samuel was gone, that the man she had come across the country to marry was already in the ground. She had stood through all of those things. She could stand through this. "I understand what you've said," she told Gerald Hatch. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Gerald Hatch nodded, as if this were the sensible conclusion to an unremarkable conversation. He turned back to Elias. "Thompson, you're a reasonable man. You know I'm not wrong." "I know you think you're not wrong," Elias said. "Those are different things." Gerald Hatch's eyes narrowed slightly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not making anything. You came to my door before sunrise to tell a widow and her children they have a week to find somewhere else to go. If this is harder than it needs to be, that's not my doing." There was a pause. One of the men behind Gerald Hatch shifted his weight. Gerald Hatch put his hat back on his head slowly, taking his time with it. "1 week," he said again, and then he turned and walked back to his horse, and the 2 men followed him, and the sound of hooves faded down the road and then was gone. Elias closed the door. Beatrice realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, her hand pressed flat against the front of her dress, as if she could feel her own heartbeat from the outside. "I'm sorry," Elias said. He turned from the door. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Don't apologize for him," she said. "I'm not apologizing for him. I'm apologizing for—" He stopped. Rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, the gesture of a man searching for words he doesn't have easy access to. "I'm apologizing for the fact that you're in a situation you didn't choose. That's all." She looked at him for a moment. He was hard to read, Elias Thompson. He had been hard to read from the first moment she'd seen him, standing on the platform in his work coat, holding his hat, watching the stagecoach come in with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply watchful. She had later understood that the watchfulness wasn't coldness. It was just the face of a man who had learned over a long time to wait and see before deciding anything. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He picked up his coffee cup again, looked into it for a moment, set it back down. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not sending you away. That much I know." She started to say something. He held up one hand, not a dismissal, just a pause. "I need to think," he said, "and you need to eat breakfast. Let's start with what we can do before we argue about what we can't." She almost said she wasn't hungry. But the smell of the coffee was already doing something to her empty stomach, and she thought of Clara and Cora waking up, and how they always woke up hungry, no matter what had happened the day before. Children were merciless in their continuity that way. The world could be falling apart, and they still needed to eat. "All right," she said. "We'll start with breakfast." The story of how Beatrice Whitmore came to be standing in Elias Thompson's kitchen at all was not a simple one, and it had a quality she would later describe, to herself, never to anyone else, as a chain of wrong turns that had somehow led somewhere right. Or at least somewhere. She was still deciding about the right. She had been married to William Whitmore for 11 years. He was a good man, a careful man, a man who loved his family and worked hard and died anyway, the way careful men sometimes do, from nothing dramatic, just a fever that held on too long in a cold February and didn't let go. He left her with Clara and Cora, age 7, and a house that turned out to have more debt attached to it than she had known, and the specific grief of someone who has lost not just a person, but the entire architecture of their daily life. The advertisement had been her sister's idea, not hers. Her sister Agnes had pressed a folded newspaper clipping into her hand at William's graveside and said, with the particular efficiency of a woman who loves you but has her own household to run, "Read this when you're ready. It's not what you think it is. The clipping was from a Western Land Company publication, a page of classified notices, and among them was a notice from a man in California named Samuel Thompson, a rancher, a widower himself, seeking a woman of good character with experience managing a household, willing to come west. There was a postal address. Nothing more. She had thrown the clipping away, then retrieved it from the bin 2 days later, then thrown it away again, then written to the address, telling herself it was only to find out more, that she wasn't committing to anything. Samuel Thompson had written back. His letters were factual and a little clumsy, but they were honest, and she had come to trust the honesty before she had come to trust anything else. He wrote about the land. He wrote about the winters. He wrote about what the work required and did not promise that it would be easy. In one letter he wrote, with a matter-of-factness that moved her more than flowery sentiment would have, "I am not a man who says things for effect. I think you would find the life hard at first, but workable. I think your children would have room to grow. I think two people who have both lost something might find they have something useful to offer each other." She had read that letter 4 times. She had written back and said yes. The journey took 6 weeks, and it was harder than she had imagined, though she had tried to imagine it honestly. The railroad to St. Louis, then the long stage lines west, in coaches that were never quite warm enough and rarely smooth enough, with Clara asking questions constantly and Cora mostly silent, watching everything with those large dark eyes that seemed to be filing away information for later use. They ate bad food at way stations and slept in accommodations that were sometimes clean and sometimes not. Beatrice did not complain. She had decided before she left Ohio that she could not afford to complain, that the luxury of complaint required a safety net she no longer possessed, and so she packed the complaints away alongside the winter coats and the family photographs and the small painted box that had been her mother's, and she carried them in silence. And then the stage had pulled into Coloma, and the first person she saw on the platform was not Samuel Thompson, but a man who was clearly his relative, the same breadth of shoulder, the same angular jaw, standing at a slight distance from the small crowd, holding his hat, watching. And before he said a single word, she knew. The way his jaw was set, the way he held himself slightly apart, the way his eyes met hers, and something moved in them that was not welcome but was, she would puzzle over this for days afterward, something close to recognition. As if he had been waiting for bad news, and here it was. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said, "I'm Elias Thompson, Samuel's brother. There's something I need to tell you." She had known before he finished the sentence. She had known from the moment she saw him standing apart from the crowd. Some part of her had known before the stage even stopped. Samuel Thompson had died of a heart failure 3 weeks before her arrival. He had written to her, apparently, to let her know he was unwell, but the letter had either been misdirected or had never found her in the chaos of the last leg of the journey. Elias had received word only a week before. He had come to the platform not knowing what else to do. He had not expected her to arrive looking the way she looked, composed, tired, one child on each side of her, a worn leather suitcase in her hand, no tears, not yet, just a stillness that he would later tell her had unsettled him more than weeping would have. He had offered her shelter for a night, just a night, to collect herself, to figure out what to do next. She had accepted. One night had become 2, and then a week, and then somehow, without either of them deciding anything specific, she was helping in the kitchen, and he was showing Clara how to feed the chickens, and Cora had discovered the barn cat's litter of kittens, and had taken up residence near the straw bales for most of the daylight hours. And they had both, carefully and without acknowledgement, stopped talking about when she was leaving, until Gerald Hatch had shown up before sunrise and made the question unavoidable. Otek. Clara and Cora appeared in the kitchen doorway within 20 minutes, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of movement. Clara came in first, as she always did. She was the one who moved forward to find out what was happening. Cora followed, observing. Elias had once said, after about the 3rd week of having them underfoot, that he had never known 2 children who were so much the same person and so entirely different at the same time. Beatrice had understood exactly what he meant. "Is something wrong?" Clara asked. She had the direct quality of a child who has learned that adults sometimes lie about whether something is wrong. and who has decided to simply ask the question flat and watch the answer. "We had an early visitor," Beatrice said. "It's nothing to worry about right now." Clara looked at her with the particular expression that meant she did not entirely believe this but was choosing to accept it for the moment. "Mr. Thompson has mud on his boots," she said, as if this were relevant data. Elias looked down at his boots. "I was out by the barn early." "Before Mr. Hatch came?" A pause. "You heard that?" Clara shrugged with one shoulder. "Some of it. He was loud." Cora said nothing, but she had moved to the window and was standing there looking out at the road. And Beatrice watched her and thought, not for the first time, that Cora understood more than she let on about nearly everything. "Sit down," Beatrice said. "Both of you. I'll make eggs." "Mr. Thompson," Clara said, not sitting down, "are we going to have to leave?" The question fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water. Elias turned from the stove to look at Clara. He looked at her for a moment with an expression Beatrice couldn't quite categorize. Something between discomfort and something softer, something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. "Where did you hear that?" "He said we had a week," Claire said. "The loud man. I heard him say it." Elias crouched down so he was closer to her height. He had started doing this at some point in the past 2 weeks, getting low before he talked to them directly, which Beatrice hadn't expected from a man who had lived alone as long as he had. He said, "I'm working on it." "That's not an answer," Claire said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. I'll have a better one by tonight. Is that good enough for now?" Clara considered this with the gravity of a small person who has learned that incomplete answers are sometimes all there is. "Okay," she said finally, and went to sit at the table. Cora peeled herself away from the window and followed. Beatrice cracked the first egg into the pan and listened to it hit the heat. Botyam. She found him that afternoon by the fence line at the far edge of the property, doing repairs that did not appear to actually need doing. She had learned this about him. When he needed to think, he worked with his hands, not because the work itself required him, but because it gave his body something to do while his mind moved. She had the same impulse, though hers expressed itself in reorganizing cupboards or mending things that were not yet broken. She brought him water. He took it without looking up from what he was doing. "You don't have to fix this," she said. He pulled a nail from his shirt pocket and positioned it. "I know that. I mean it. You've already done more than you needed to. You could have put us on the next stage the day we arrived. You didn't. It was generous. I don't want you to feel like the obligation goes further than that." He drove the nail in with 2 efficient swings and looked up. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation?" She held his gaze. "I don't know what it is. I don't think you've decided yet either." He was quiet for a moment. A hawk moved somewhere overhead, and they both heard its call without looking up. "When Samuel and I were boys," he said, "our father used to say that the worst thing a man could do was make a decision out of fear. He didn't mean that decisions shouldn't be hard. He meant that fear was a rotten foundation, that things built on it didn't hold." "What does that have to do with—" "Hatch is afraid," Elias said. "Not of you specifically, of the idea that things might change, that the rules he's built his life around might not be the only rules. It makes men like him grip harder." He set down his hammer. "But I didn't let you stay because I was afraid of what happened to you if I didn't. I let you stay because—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "Because it didn't feel right to do anything else. That's the most honest thing I can say about it." Beatrice looked at him for a long moment. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "What are you going to do about Hatch?" He picked the hammer back up. "I'm going to go talk to some people," he said. "There are men on that committee who aren't Hatch, who think differently. Hatch is loud. Doesn't mean he speaks for everyone." "And if he does?" Elias considered this with the same deliberate patience he brought to everything. "Then I'll deal with what's actually in front of me," he said. "Not the version of it I'm afraid of." She watched him go back to his work. The sun was falling westward, and the light came sideways across the field, and she thought about what he had said and didn't say, about obligation and fear and foundations, and she thought about William, who had been nothing like this man, who had been warmer, easier, quicker to laugh, And she understood, standing there in the late afternoon with the smell of grass and dry earth around her, that grief was not a thing with a door you walked through and then left behind. It was a room you carried with you. You just gradually furnished it differently. She walked back toward the house, and behind her she heard the sound of the hammer, steady and purposeful, not hurrying. Ichid. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Elias sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil and wrote a list of names. He said nothing about it directly. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and said he would be gone in the morning for most of the day, that the horses would need water by mid-afternoon and there was enough wood already split for the stove. She said she knew how to water horses and work a stove. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. "I know you do," he said. "I'm not explaining it because I think you don't know. I'm explaining it because—" He paused. "Because I'm not used to having someone here. I keep explaining things that don't need explaining." "It's all right," she said. He looked at the paper in his pocket for a moment, as if he could see it through the fabric. "There are 7 men on the Valley Committee," he said. "Hatch is one. But Martin Fry and his brother Joseph, they're reasonable men. And old Davis, he doesn't like Hatch much. Hasn't for years." He said this the way someone states facts they're trying to arrange into a shape. "I'm going to talk to them, not to beg, just to let them hear the situation the way it actually is, instead of the version Hatch has been telling." "What version has he been telling?" "I don't know exactly," Elias said. "But with men like Hatch, the version they tell is always the one where they're restoring order, where they're doing what needs to be done. He'll have made you sound like a problem." Beatrice folded her hands on the table. She had done a lot of that lately, folding her hands, finding something to do with them that wasn't gripping. "And what will you tell them?" "The truth," he said. "That my brother left a woman in a situation she didn't choose. That I'm not willing to make it worse. That what they do with that is up to them." He looked at her directly. "And that you're not going anywhere until you have somewhere real to go, which you don't." She didn't say thank you. She didn't think he wanted that. She said, "I'll have the horses watered before noon." He nodded once and went to bed. And she sat at the table a while longer, listening to the house settle around her, the creak of timber cooling, the distant sound of some animal in the dark outside. And she thought about what it would feel like if it all came apart. If Hatch won, and the committee ruled against them, and there was a stage going east and 2 children to pack up and nowhere to go but back to people who would receive her with kindness and no room for her to actually live. She thought about it the way you think about a thing you're trying to understand rather than fear. Then she went to bed. Through the wall, she could hear Cora murmuring in her sleep, some dream language that had no words. And the sound of it was so ordinary, so domestic, so fully the sound of a child in a house at night, that something in her chest loosened slightly. Not much, but a little. Cheb. He came back from his visits later than she expected, arriving at the edge of dark with his horse tired and his coat dusty, and he ate the supper she had kept warm without sitting down first to wash up, which was not like him. She watched him eat and didn't ask. Clara asked twice and was redirected both times. Cora watched with those large, careful eyes and said nothing. When the girls were in bed and the dishes were done, she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him and waited. He looked at the cup, then at her. "Martin Fry is with us?" he said. "His brother too, probably. Old Davis won't commit to anything specific, but he told me, and I'm quoting the man, 'Gerald Hatch has been a pain in my side since 1859, and I am not inclined to do him any favors.'" Something in his voice shifted, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. "That's 3, she said. "What about the others?" "The other 3 I couldn't reach today. 2 of them I'll try tomorrow." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Hatch has one man solid, fellow named Garrett. He'll do whatever Hatch says. That's just how it is." He paused. "But if Martin and Joseph are with us, and Davis and one of the remaining 2, that's a majority. And if it's not—" He looked at her steadily. "Then I fight it some other way," he said. "But I'm not sending you away, Beatrice. I need you to hear me say that plainly." She had not given him permission to use her first name. He had started doing it without asking, sometime in the 2nd week, and she had not corrected it, and now it sounded entirely ordinary, the way things do when you let them settle. Elias, she said, and she watched something move in his expression at the sound of his own name from her, just slightly, just enough to notice, I need you to understand something as well. I'm not a cause. I'm not a situation you've taken on because it was the right thing to do. If you're fighting this, and I understand if you're not, I do. I need it to be because you want to, not because you'd feel guilty otherwise. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the house settled once more around them, and somewhere outside a night bird made a sound and then stopped. I know the difference, he said finally, between what I do out of guilt and what I do because I want to. I've had a lot of years to learn the difference. He paused. I want to. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them made the light small and warm, and outside was all dark and the wide, empty frontier, and somewhere in the back of the house her daughters were sleeping, and Beatrice Whitmore, who had taught herself not to want things too clearly in case they were taken away, allowed herself to want this ordinary, precarious, half-built thing, just a little. All right, she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. That was enough for tonight. The morning after Elias rode out to talk to the committee men, Beatrice found the ranch account book on the kitchen table with a note tucked inside the front cover. The note was brief, written in Elias's hand, angular letters, the writing of a man who had learned it practically rather than formally. Numbers are off somewhere in March. Couldn't find where. If you have time. That was all. No, please. No explanation of what he meant by off. Just the assumption that she would understand what he was asking and the quiet confidence that she was capable of doing it. She sat down with the book and a cup of coffee and found the error in 40 minutes. A transposition in a feed purchase entry. A 6 written as a 9. The kind of mistake that happened when a tired man was recording numbers by lamplight after a long day. She corrected it, noted the correction on a separate slip of paper so he could see what had been wrong, and set it back where she'd found it. It was a small thing, but she noticed that he had left it for her rather than struggling with it himself, and she understood this was not laziness. It was something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. The girls were restless that day. The uncertainty of the morning before had settled into them the way weather settles into old bones, not discussed, but felt. Clara kept finding reasons to be in whatever room Beatrice was in. Cora had retreated to the barn and the kittens, which was her method of managing things she couldn't control. Beatrice let them both do what they needed to do and tried not to let her own anxiety run too visibly, though she suspected Clara, at minimum, was tracking it closely. By mid-afternoon, she had watered the horses as she'd said, split some additional wood that was already split well enough but needed something to do with her hands, and started a pot of bean soup from the stores in the pantry. She was checking the bread she'd set to rise that morning when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the road. Not Elias, the gait was different, and she went to the window. A woman she didn't recognize was riding toward the house, alone, on a brown mare that moved with the ease of an animal ridden regularly and well. The woman was perhaps 50, with a direct posture and a practical hat, and the kind of face that had been outdoor weathered for a long time without apology. She pulled up at the front of the house, tied the mare to the post, and knocked with 3 firm raps. Beatrice opened the door. "Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said, "I'm Ruth Fry, Martin's wife. I thought it might be a good time to introduce myself." Beatrice looked at her for a moment, then, "Come in, I have coffee." Ruth Fry came in and sat at the kitchen table with the straightforwardness of someone accustomed to going places and making herself comfortable without making a fuss about it. She looked around the kitchen with a quick, practical eye. Not judging, Beatrice thought, just noting. The way a person looks at a space when they're trying to understand how it's being lived in. "Martin told me he talked to Elias this morning," Ruth said. "Elias told me," Beatrice said, pouring the coffee. "Martin is going to vote with him. I want you to know that isn't just Martin being agreeable. He thought about it for about 10 minutes and then said, 'Hatch is wrong.' And that was the end of his deliberating." She accepted the coffee cup. "Martin takes about 10 minutes to decide most things. I take longer, but I usually end up in the same place." Beatrice sat across from her. "And where did you end up?" Ruth Fry looked at her steadily. That a woman who travels across the country with 2 children to start a new life and arrives to find the man she was coming to marry already buried deserves better than being told she has a week to disappear. She said it plainly, without inflection, as if it were simply a true thing being stated. And that Gerald Hatch has had the run of this valley's social opinion for too long, and it's done nobody any good. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at Ruth Fry with frank curiosity, and said, "Who are you?" "Clara," Beatrice said. "It's all right," Ruth said. She looked at Clara. "I'm Ruth. My husband knows you're—" She paused, just briefly. "Knows Elias." "Is he helping?" Clara said. "With the loud man?" "He is," Ruth said. Clara considered this, then nodded once with an air of having received and filed a useful piece of information, and withdrew. Ruth Fry looked at Beatrice with something that might have been amusement. "How old is she?" "8, Beatrice said. "Both of them. They're twins." "Lord," Ruth said, and then, more quietly, "You've got your hands full." "I always have," Beatrice said, and then, because it was true and she hadn't said it to anyone, "It's easier here than it was. The space helps. They were in the boarding house in Ohio after William died. They were in one room, the 3 of us, for 3 months." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. Ruth Fry didn't make a sympathetic noise or reach across the table or do any of the things that people did when they heard something difficult. She just said, 3 months in one room with 2 8-year-olds would try a saint. And then, "Have you had any word yet on what the other committee men are likely to do?" The conversation shifted to practical ground, and Beatrice felt something ease in her shoulders. She was tired of being the subject of other people's sympathy. It was easier to talk about facts. They talked for an hour. Ruth knew the men on the committee, knew their histories, their grudges, their particular sensitivities. She described old Davis as a man who deeply mistrusted any situation where Gerald Hatch was the one calling for action. She described the 2 remaining men, Hosea Bright and Leonard Kell, with more care. Hosea Bright was a church deacon who would be concerned, Ruth said, with the appearance of propriety. Leonard Kell was harder to predict. He was a fair man when he wasn't being lazy about it, and sometimes his laziness won. "Elias needs to get to Hosea Bright before Hatch does," Ruth said. "Hatch will put the worst construction on everything. If Hosea hears the story first from Gerald, it'll be harder to undo." "I'll tell Elias tonight," Beatrice said. Ruth nodded and stood. She put her hat back on with the efficiency of someone who had spent no time in her life being precious about it. At the door she turned. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll be honest with you about something." "Please," Beatrice said. "This valley has been a certain way for a long time. Some of it's fine and some of it isn't. Hatch isn't the only one who likes things the way they were, but there are enough people who are tired of him deciding what the way things were ought to look like." She looked at Beatrice directly. "You're not as alone here as you probably feel." Beatrice stood in the doorway and watched Ruth Fry untie her horse and ride back down the road with the same unhurried efficiency with which she'd arrived, and she thought about what it meant to be told you were not alone by someone who had no obligation to say so. It meant something. She was careful not to let it mean too much yet, but it meant something. Elias came back that evening with his coat darker with dust than the day before, and a look on his face that she had started to be able to read. Not readable easily, not yet, but starting to be. The look that meant he'd had a day with things in it that had gone some ways good and some ways not. She waited until the girls were settled and then told him about Ruth Fry's visit and what Ruth had said about Hosea Bright. He sat very still for a moment, then said a word under his breath that he immediately glanced at her to apologize for. "I was planning to see Hosea tomorrow," he said, "but if Hatch has already talked to him, you don't know that he has." "I know how Hatch works," Elias said. "He'll move fast on the ones who might be persuadable. He knows he's probably lost Davis, so he'll work on Hosea and Leonard." He stood up from the table and went to the window, which was something she'd noticed he did when he needed to think without looking at anything specific. "I should have gone to Hosea first." "You couldn't have known. I should have thought it through better." She looked at his back. "Elias." He turned. You rode to 3 separate properties today to talk to men on behalf of a woman you've known for less than a month. I don't think this is the moment to fault your strategy." He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in it. The set of his jaw loosened just slightly. "Ruth Fry is a sharp woman," he said. "She is," Beatrice agreed. "You should thank Martin for marrying her." He almost smiled. Again, not quite, but closer than usual. He sat back down and they talked through the remaining men, Hosea Bright, Leonard Kell, and what the approach to each ought to be, and Beatrice found herself thinking, not for the first time, that she had come west expecting to learn the shape of a life she'd agreed to from a distance, and instead she was learning the shape of a life she hadn't agreed to at all, which was turning out to be, and she was cautious with this word, careful about using it even in her own thoughts, better. Not easier. Not simpler. But better in some way she didn't fully understand yet. Ma'am. The next morning, Elias was gone before the girls woke up. He'd left bread on the table and the stove banked, and the account book was in its place on the shelf, with her correction slip still inside it. She made breakfast and got Claire and Cora through the morning routine and thought about Ruth Fry's words. "You're not as alone here as you probably feel." Around 10 o'clock, Clara appeared at her elbow while she was hanging laundry and said, without preamble, "Mr. Thompson doesn't talk much." "No," Beatrice agreed. "Papa talked a lot," Clara said. "He always had a story about something." The sheets moved in the dry morning wind. Beatrice reached for another clothespin. "Your father was very good at stories," she said. "Do you think Mr. Thompson has any stories?" She thought about it honestly. "I think he has them," she said. "I think he keeps them for longer before he tells them." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you like him?" "Clara." "I'm just asking." "I know you are." Beatrice looked at her daughter, this small, particular, relentless person who had arrived in her life screaming and had basically not stopped raising questions since. "Yes," she said. "I like him." Clara nodded as if this settled something. "Cora likes him too," she said. "She told the barn cat." "How do you know?" "I heard her," Clara said simply, and went back inside. Beatrice stood with the laundry and thought about that and tried not to find it as significant as it felt. Cora did not offer her opinions to people, only to animals. The fact that Elias Thompson had made the list of things Cora was willing to express an opinion about, even at one remove, was not a small thing. She finished the laundry and went inside and did not allow herself to think about it any further. Tbum. Elias reached Hosea Bright's property by mid-morning and found the man in his workshop behind the main house, repairing a wagon wheel with the concentration of someone who was using the work to avoid thinking about something else. Hosea Bright was 63, white-haired, careful, a man who weighed things before he said them, and sometimes weighed them long enough that the conversation moved on without him. "Elias," he said, not stopping his work. "Hosea." Elias leaned against the doorframe. "Has Gerald Hatch been to see you?" A pause. Hosea set down his tool. "Yesterday afternoon," he said. So Hatch had moved faster than Elias had anticipated. He kept his face neutral and said, "What did he tell you?" Hosea looked at him directly. "He told me there was a widow living under your roof and that the situation was improper and needed to be corrected." He paused. "He used more words than that, but that was the substance." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it," Hosea said, which from Hosea Bright was not a commitment to anything except its literal meaning. Elias straightened from the doorframe. "Can I tell you the situation as it actually is?" "That's why I didn't tell him yes," Hosea said. So Elias told him. He told it the way he'd told Martin Fry. Factually, without drama, the same way he would describe a problem with a fence or an issue with the water supply. Samuel's death. Beatrice's arrival. The absence of any reasonable alternative for a woman with 2 children and no family within 2,000 miles. He said nothing about what he felt. He wasn't prepared to do that yet, wasn't sure he had words for it that he trusted. But he told the facts plainly, and let the facts carry what they could. Hosea listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, Hosea was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The girls, they doing all right?" It was not the question Elias had expected. "Yes," he said. "The older one asks a lot of questions. The other one mostly watches things. Hosea nodded slowly. My wife came west from Pennsylvania, he said. 30 years ago. She came on her own, which people thought was strange. She didn't have family here either. He picked up his tool again. I'm going to think about this properly before I tell you anything, but I want you to know that I don't think a woman being self-sufficient is the same as a woman being a problem. Gerald Hatch conflates those two things on a regular basis. Elias said, That's fair. Come back Thursday, Hosea said. I'll have an answer by then. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, and it wasn't Hatch's version of events going unchallenged. Elias rode to Leonard Kell's property next and found him less available. Kell had a crew doing repairs on his north fence and was distracted and short with it, and Elias could read the moment well enough to know that pressing for a full conversation wasn't going to yield anything useful. He made his case briefly, kept it to the essential facts, said he'd appreciate Kell thinking it through, and left before he overstayed. Sometimes the best argument you could make was to not make one too loudly. He rode back to the ranch in the long light of afternoon, turning it all in his head. Martin Fry was solid. His brother Joseph, Martin had confirmed, was leaning the same direction. Davis was reliable in his dislike of Hatch, even if not in any particular affection for the situation itself. Hosea Bright was undeclared but thoughtful. Kell was undeclared and distracted. Hatch and Garrett were against. If it went to a formal vote, he needed 4. He might have 3. He might have 4. He couldn't be certain until Thursday. He didn't like uncertainty. He never had. His brother Samuel had been able to live with uncertainty better than he could. Samuel had an ease with the undefined that Elias had always envied and never managed to acquire. Samuel had proposed to Beatrice Whitmore by post, which Elias would never have been able to do, not because he was incapable of the gesture, but because the commitment of it before he'd seen the thing with his own eyes would have been impossible. He needed to see. He needed to know what was in front of him. What was in front of him right now was a woman who corrected his accounting errors without making him feel like a fool for having them, whose daughters were starting to treat his barn like it belonged to them, and who had stood in his kitchen doorway while a man twice her social standing told her to leave and had looked at that man like he was a mild inconvenience rather than a threat. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with all of that, but he knew what he didn't want, which was for it to end on Gerald Hatch's schedule. Thursday came with low clouds and a smell of rain that didn't arrive. Elias left before breakfast, and Beatrice found the morning harder to occupy than usual, which annoyed her because she was not a woman who was used to waiting and she didn't intend to start. She set Clara to mending. Clara hated mending but was passably good at it, and the occupation kept her from asking too many questions, and took Cora with her to check the kitchen garden that she'd begun quietly rehabilitating over the past 10 days. The garden had been neglected for at least 2 seasons. Whoever had tended it last, a woman, she assumed, some earlier inhabitant of this house, who had taken the habit of growing things with her when she left, had left the beds in a reasonable state, just untended. Beatrice had been pulling weeds and turning earth in the early mornings before the heat settled, not because Elias had asked her to, but because there was something about the having of a garden that felt like a declaration of intent, like saying, I am here long enough to care what grows. Cora knelt beside her in the dirt, carefully pulling up a weed by its root with the thoroughness of someone who wanted to get the whole thing and not leave any part behind. Cora did most things this way. Will these grow fast? She asked. It was more words than she typically used before noon. Some of them, Beatrice said. The beans will take a while. The lettuce is already coming. Will we be here when the beans come? Cora said. Beatrice stopped pulling weeds. She sat back on her heels and looked at her daughter. This careful, quiet child who noticed everything and said very little of it out loud, who had watched every single thing that happened in this house over the past weeks with those large, precise eyes, and processed it in whatever internal room she kept her most important thinking. I hope so, Beatrice said. It was the honest answer. Cora received it without visible distress, turned back to her weeding, and said, I think we should be. Beatrice looked at her. We're useful here, Cora said with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting an observation. Clara helps with the animals. You fixed the numbers in the book. I found the loose board in the chicken coop before any of them got out. She paused. We're useful. People should keep useful things. Beatrice pressed her lips together. There was something in the simplicity of it. Useful things. that was both practical and slightly heartbreaking, the way children's logic sometimes was, cutting straight to the bone of something without knowing it. "We're not things," Beatrice said gently. "You know what I mean," Cora said. "I do," Beatrice said. And, "Yes, I think we should be here too." Elias came back early afternoon. Beatrice was in the kitchen and she heard him ride in and heard the particular way he dismounted. She had learned the sounds of this place without meaning to, the specific acoustic signature of daily life on this property. Elias's boot hitting the stirrup a certain way, the creak of the specific gatepost, and she knew before he came through the door that something had shifted. Not from the sounds, from the absence of sounds. He wasn't moving at his usual pace. He came in and stood in the doorway for a moment, and she turned from the stove and looked at him, and his face was not exactly unreadable, but complicated. A face that had several things in it at once. "Hosea Bright is with us," he said. "He told me this morning." She felt something release in her chest. "That's 4, she said. "That's 4, he confirmed. 4 out of 7. A majority. Enough. She turned back to the stove because she needed to do something with her hands. "And Kel?" "Kel is going to vote with Hatch," Elias said. "He told me this morning too. Didn't want to, I think. He had the look of a man who knows he's taking the wrong side but has already committed himself." He came further into the kitchen and sat down heavily in the chair. "It doesn't matter. 4 is enough." She stirred the pot. "Did Hatch know?" "He'll know by tonight," Elias said. "Martin Fry said the committee meets Friday." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He's not going to take it well." "No," she said. "He won't." "I want you to be prepared for that. Hatch losing a vote doesn't mean Hatch stops. Men like him, they find other ways." She turned from the stove. "Elias, I survived a winter in a one-room boarding house with twins who were grieving their father, and I'm still standing. I can manage Gerald Hatch finding other ways." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you can," he said, and the way he said it, not reassuring her, not humoring her, just stating it as a clear observed fact, was somehow more settling than any more elaborate expression would have been. Clara came in from outside with dirt on her boots and said, "Did something happen?" with the accuracy of a child who had been tracking the emotional weather of the house all week. Elias told her that things were going to be all right, and for once Clara didn't press him on whether that was a real answer or not. She seemed to decide to accept it. She sat down at the table and began unlacing her boots with the concentration of someone who needed to do something with her hands, too, and the three of them were in the kitchen together in the last of the afternoon light, and it was not comfortable exactly, not yet, but it was something. Outside, the clouds that had threatened rain all day finally made good on their word, and the first drops came down slow and deliberate on the dry ground, and the smell of it came through the window, that first rain smell that was not quite like anything else. And Cora appeared from the direction of the barn at a run, her hair coming loose, her face entirely unguarded, and burst through the kitchen door saying, "It's raining," as if they hadn't noticed, as if this were news, as if rain on a dry frontier afternoon were a thing worth running to announce. And Elias Thompson, who had not laughed, really laughed, the full unguarded kind, in Beatrice's presence before that moment, laughed. It came out of him like something that had been stored under pressure, sudden and unself-conscious. And Cora stopped in the doorway looking startled, and then Clara started laughing at the sound of it without knowing why. And Beatrice stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand and felt something warm move through her chest that she had not felt in a long time. She didn't call it anything, she just let it be there. Outside, the rain came down steady now, the kind that would actually soak in, and the dry ground took it, and the garden that was just beginning to come back absorbed every drop. The committee meeting was held on a Friday morning in the back room of the Coloma Trading Post, which was also the room where men settled land disputes, argued water rights, and occasionally said things to each other that were not said again in polite company. Beatrice knew this because Ruth Fry had told her, and Ruth knew because she had spent 20 years learning exactly how this valley's unofficial machinery worked, which men pulled, which levers, which rooms. Things were actually decided in, as opposed to the rooms where decisions were announced. Elias left at dawn. He ate standing up, which he only did when he was thinking hard about something else. And he took his good coat off the peg by the door, the one he wore to town, heavier wool, the collar still clean, and put it on without comment. Beatrice poured him coffee, and he took it with a nod and drank half of it and set the cup down and picked up his hat. At the door he paused. "I'll be back by noon," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a moment. That watchful, considering look she had come to understand was not distance but attention, that it was actually the opposite of distance. And then he left, and she heard his horse on the road, and then she heard nothing but the ordinary sounds of the morning. Clara came in 10 minutes later and looked at the half-empty coffee cup and said, "He left early." "The meeting is this morning," Beatrice said. Clara sat down. She picked up a piece of bread from the plate on the table and held it without eating it. What happens if they say no? Beatrice had been asking herself the same question since Thursday night, turning it in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking at each face of it. She had not arrived at an answer that satisfied her, which meant she had arrived at honesty instead. "Then we figure out the next thing," she said. "What's the next thing?" "I don't know yet, but there's always a next thing." She sat across from Clara. "Your grandmother used to say that worry was just planning with all the facts missing. I've been trying to remember that." Clara looked at her. Grandma also said that Papa was terrible with money, and she was right about that too, so maybe she was just smart in general. Beatrice blinked. Then she laughed. Short, real, the kind that surprised her coming out. "Yes," she said. "I think that's probably accurate." Clara finally ate the bread. Some of the tension in her small shoulders let go, and Beatrice watched it go and was grateful for the small mercies of children who could be redirected if you found the right angle. Cora appeared from the back of the house, already dressed, and went to the window. "It's going to be hot today," she said, with the authority of someone who had been reading skies for longer than 8 years. "Yes," Beatrice agreed. "The beans need water." "Then we'll water the beans." And so the morning passed, in the way that difficult mornings sometimes do. Not easily, not without the low, persistent hum of anxiety underneath everything, but with the ordinary work of living that continues regardless of what is being decided in back rooms elsewhere. Beatrice watered the garden. Cora moved methodically along the rows beside her. Clara, who had finished her mending the day before, found the loose shutter on the west side of the house that Beatrice had noticed 3 days ago, and had not mentioned to Elias because there were only so many things a person could bring to someone else's attention before it started to feel like complaint. Clara was attempting to fix it herself with a piece of wire and more determination than skill. Beatrice watched her through the window and decided not to intervene until something actually went wrong. Nothing went wrong. The shutter held. Clara came inside looking pleased with herself in the specific way she looked when she had accomplished something she hadn't been entirely sure she could accomplish. "I fixed it," she said. "I saw," Beatrice said. "Mr. Thompson would have done it different," Clara added, with the fairness of someone who acknowledges a superior method without conceding that their own was without merit. "But mine works." "Yours works," Beatrice confirmed. "That's the part that matters." Elias came back at 11:30, which was earlier than noon, and told her something before he said a word. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she made herself continue doing what she was doing, which was measuring flour, an activity that required just enough attention to prevent her from going straight to the door. She heard him come up the step, heard the door, and then he was standing in the kitchen, and she turned. His face was not the face of a man who had lost, but it was not entirely the face of a man who had won cleanly either. It was the face of a man who had gotten what he needed and was already thinking about what it cost. 4-3, he said. "Martin, Joseph, Davis, and Hosea." She set down the measuring cup. "It's done?" "The formal decision is done," he said. He came to the table and sat, and she noticed he was tired in a way that went deeper than the physical. Hatch contested it, said the vote should require a supermajority for decisions affecting community standards. Martin told him the committee bylaws said no such thing. Hatch said the bylaws needed revisiting. Martin told him to bring that to the next meeting. He paused. There was a while where it was loud. Did Hatch say anything about... She stopped, unsure how to finish the question. About you specifically? Elias looked at the table. He said that a woman of uncertain prospects living in an unmarried man's home was a signal of moral looseness and that the committee had a duty to the families of this valley to uphold standards. He said it flatly. The way you repeat something you found distasteful without adding to the distaste by inflecting it. Davis told him that uncertainty of prospects was not a character flaw and that he was confusing misfortune with wrongdoing. Davis doesn't usually say that much in one sentence. I think Hatch surprised it out of him. Beatrice sat down across from him. Her hands were floury and she pressed them flat on the table. What does it mean now, practically? It means the committee has formally declined to take any action against the current arrangement, Elias said. It means Hatch doesn't have official ground to stand on. But he'll still stand on something. Yes, Elias said, he will. She had expected this. She had turned it over enough times in the past week to have arrived at a clear understanding of it. A vote was a constraint, not a resolution. Gerald Hatch was not a man who accepted constraint without finding a way around it, and a man like that, in a small valley, had more tools than a formal committee process. He had neighbors who owed him favors. He had a wife who talked. He had the slow accumulation of small social cuts that didn't register individually but added up over time. I know, she said. I'm not going to pretend it's finished. Elias looked at her. You're not afraid of him. I'm not afraid of him, she said precisely. I just don't think being afraid of him helps me much. Something moved in his expression. Samuel used to say something like that, he said, and then, as if he hadn't quite meant to say it, he would have liked you. The sentence arrived unexpectedly, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest, not painfully, but with weight. Samuel Thompson was a complicated presence in this house, in this situation. He was the reason she had come, and the reason the whole situation existed, and she had thought about him more than she would have expected, had built in her mind a picture of him from his letters, and from the occasional things Elias said, and from the particular kind of absence he represented. She had not loved Samuel. They had never met, and love required something more than the careful, honest exchange of letters. But she had trusted him, and losing the thing she had been trusting toward had been its own specific grief, separate from and alongside her grief for William. He seemed like he would have been a good man to know, she said. He was, Elias said. Simple, direct, no more or less than that. The way he spoke about his brother, rarely. But when he did, with this same quality of plain statement, told her things about Elias that he had never said directly. That the loss was not healed, that it was not being used as a story, that it was just simply present, the way some losses are, permanently woven into the fabric of ordinary days. Clara came in from outside, read the room with her usual precision, and said, "Did it go okay?" "It went okay," Elias said. Clara looked at him, looked at Beatrice, looked at Elias again. "You both look like it went okay, but there's more to it." "There usually is," Elias said. Clara absorbed this adult statement with the expression of someone filing it under true things that are unsatisfying. "I fixed the shutter," she said. Elias glanced toward the window. "Which one?" "West side." He was quiet for a moment. "That one's been loose since March," he said. "I kept meaning to get to it." "I used wire," Clara said. "It works." "I'll take a look at it," he said, and Clara's expression shifted into something that was not quite pride, but was close to it. The particular satisfaction of having done something that was acknowledged by someone whose acknowledgement meant something. She went back outside. The door swung shut behind her. Elias looked at the closed door for a moment. "She fixed the shutter," he said, as if confirming it for himself. "She's been watching you," Beatrice said. "Both of them have. They watch how things are done here, and then they try to do them." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'll look at it properly and add a nail, so it holds through winter." He said it like a practical statement about a shutter, but she understood, and she thought he understood, that it was also a statement about something else, about assuming winter, about the long unspoken future that neither of them had put into direct words yet. Gerald Hatch's response to the committee vote came not in the form of another dawn visit or a formal confrontation, but in the form of a rumor, which was in some ways more insidious than either. Ruth Fry was the one who told Beatrice, arriving on her brown mare on a Tuesday afternoon with her practical hat and her direct manner. And this time she came in and sat and accepted coffee and said without preamble, "There's a story going around that you came to Coloma with debts that Samuel Thompson agreed to cover, and that you've attached yourself to Elias to avoid repayment." Beatrice set down her cup. "That's not true." "I know it's not true, Upas," Ruth said. "But 3 women at the dry goods store heard it this week, and 2 of them repeated it. Hatch didn't say it himself. He never says these things himself. But his wife was there when it started." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. The particular anger she felt was not hot. It was the cold, specific anger of someone who has been made into a false story by a person who knows exactly how much damage a story can do in a small place. "What are people saying?" "Some are repeating it, some aren't." Ruth looked at her directly. Mrs. Wheeler, who runs the boarding house, said she had never heard anything like that, and that, in her experience, a woman who crossed the country alone with 2 small children had better things to spend her energy on than constructing financial schemes, which is as close to public contradiction as we get around here from Edna Wheeler. That was kind of her. "Edna Wheeler is not particularly kind," Ruth said. "She's practical. She saw what she saw when you came through town, and she's not interested in having her own observations overwritten by Gerald Hatch's wife." She paused. "But you should know it's out there. Elias should know." Beatrice told him that evening. She told it the same way Ruth had told it, directly, without dramatizing it, just the facts of what was being said and where it had come from. She watched his face as she told it, and saw a coldness come into it that she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly. Something harder and more contained than anger. "He knows it's not true," Elias said. When he said he, there was no ambiguity about who he meant. "Yes," she said. "He knows. So he's not doing it to correct a misunderstanding. He's doing it because he lost the vote, and this is what he has left." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have any of Samuel's letters, the ones he wrote you before you came?" She looked at him. "Yes, I kept them." "All of them?" "All of them." She had kept them in the small painted box that had been her mother's, with the family photographs and a few other things she considered unreplaceable. She had not looked at them since arriving in Coloma. She hadn't been ready to. "There's probably something in them about the arrangement you had agreed to," Elias said. "The terms of it, whether there were any debts involved." She understood what he was suggesting. Documentation. The letters as evidence that the arrangement between her and Samuel had been straightforward. A marriage proposal, not a financial agreement, certainly not one involving debts she had no knowledge of. "You think it would help to have people see them?" "I think it would help to have Martin Fry see them," he said. "Martin talks to people, and if Martin has seen the actual letters and can speak to what they contain, that's more effective than anything I could say." It was a practical suggestion, and she knew it was right. And she also knew that showing Samuel's letters to Martin Fry meant taking them out of the painted box and reading them again, which she was not sure she was ready to do. But readiness, she had learned, was a luxury. You did what was necessary, and readiness followed, or it didn't. "I'll get them," she said. She went to the back room where the painted box sat on the shelf above the cot. She lifted the lid. The smell of the inside of the box was the smell of her mother's house, inexplicably, even after all this distance and time, some combination of cedar and something else she couldn't name, the specific olfactory signature of a life she no longer had access to. The letters were there, tied with a piece of string, in Samuel's angular handwriting that looked so much like Elias's that the first time she'd seen Elias write something she'd had to look away. She took them out and carried them back to the kitchen. Elias looked at them on the table and didn't reach for them. "You don't have to let me read them," he said. "I just need to know if there's anything in them about financial terms." "There isn't," she said. "He offered a home and a partnership. I offered experience managing a household. There was no discussion of money beyond the travel costs, which I paid myself." She paused. "But you can read them if you want to." He looked at her. "Do you want me to?" She thought about it honestly. I think you should know who he was, she said. From himself. Not from me, not from memory, from what he actually wrote. She pushed the letters toward him. He was your brother. You have more right to them than I do. Elias looked at the letters for a long moment. He reached out and put one hand on top of them, not picking them up, just resting his hand there. His jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was holding something tightly inside. Not tonight, he said finally. Maybe not soon. He took his hand back. But thank you. She nodded. She put the letters back on the table between them. I'll talk to Martin tomorrow, Elias said. Tell him what you told me about the content. That's enough for him to work with. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, the letters between them, and she thought about the strangeness of this. Sitting across from a man she had not planned to know, in a house she had not planned to live in, discussing the letters she had written to his dead brother, with a committee vote behind them, and Gerald Hatch's rumors ahead of them, and 2 children asleep in the back room, and the entire uncertain future spread out past the edges of the lamplight. It was not the life she had imagined when she'd said yes to those letters, but she had stopped, somewhere in the past weeks, grieving the imagined life. She was too occupied with the actual one. The confrontation with Hatch, not the official one, not the committee room, but the real one, the one that happened in public without warning, came on a Saturday at the trading post. Beatrice had gone in with Clara and Cora for supplies. It was the first time she had gone to town since the committee vote, and she had gone deliberately, not because she needed urgently what the trading post carried, but because not going would have felt like hiding, and she had decided she was done hiding from Gerald Hatch's version of events. She wore her good dress, not the best one, the one she kept for actual formal occasions, but the blue one that fit well and looked like a woman who had intentions. Clara had her hair properly braided. Cora had clean boots, which was as dressed as Cora ever really got, and the fact that she had managed clean boots without being asked twice was its own small declaration. The trading post was moderately busy for a Saturday morning. Mrs. Wheeler was there, and the Fry brothers, and a handful of people Beatrice recognized by face without knowing by name. She was halfway through her list when Gerald Hatch came in. He saw her immediately. He was the kind of man who always scanned a room when he entered it. Not from anxiety, from habit, the habit of a man who liked to know the geography of any situation before he committed to moving through it. His eyes found her and stayed for a moment, and then he moved into the room as if she weren't there, which was its own form of statement. She kept to her list. The trading post had a long counter along one wall and a series of shelves behind it, and the proprietor, a thin man named Adler, who ran the place with exhausted efficiency, was moving between customers. Beatrice was at the counter when she heard Hatch's voice from across the room, addressing someone she couldn't see, pitched just loud enough to carry. Community standards, he was saying, are either worth defending or they aren't. A vote is one thing. What people choose to accept in their own houses is another. She kept her eyes on her list. I've always said, Hatch continued, that a woman alone is a particular kind of problem. Not her fault, necessarily. Just the nature of the situation. Clara, who was standing beside Beatrice, went very still. Beatrice put one hand briefly on her shoulder. Just a touch, a small signal. Not yet, not now. I've got this. Salt, she said to Adler. A full pound. The question, Hatch was saying, is what kind of example, Mr. Hatch? The voice was not Beatrice's. It was Cora's. The room did one of those things that rooms sometimes do, where the ambient sound level drops without anyone specifically deciding to be quiet. Beatrice turned. Cora was standing 4 feet away from Gerald Hatch with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her large dark eyes absolutely direct. And she was 8 years old, and she was looking at a man of 60-something, as if he were a problem she was capable of categorizing. Cora, Beatrice said. You're talking about us, Cora said to Hatch, not accusing, not afraid, stating a fact. You keep talking about us in rooms where we're standing. I want to know why you don't just say it to us. The silence in the room was total. Gerald Hatch looked at Cora with the expression of a man who has been addressed by an 8-year-old in public and cannot find the appropriate response without looking worse than he already does. Several people in the trading post were watching with the careful attentiveness of those who want to see what happens next without appearing to. Little girl, Hatch started. My name is Cora Whitmore, Cora said. My mother is Beatrice Whitmore. We came here from Ohio because Mr. Samuel Thompson asked us to. He died before we got here, which wasn't our fault and wasn't his fault and wasn't anybody's fault. Mr. Elias Thompson gave us a place to stay because otherwise we would have had nowhere. I don't understand why that makes you angry, but it does. And I think if you have something to say, you should say it to us and not around us. She said it the way she did most things, precisely, without drama, as if she were simply reporting what was true. The effect was considerable. Martin Fry, who was near the door, made a sound that was clearly a suppressed laugh, converted at the last second into a cough. Hatch looked at Cora for a moment, then he looked at Beatrice. His expression was the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered but cannot locate exactly how it happened. You should teach your children to mind their place, he said. I teach my children to say true things, Beatrice said. I think Cora said several. Hatch looked around the room with the look of a man searching for allies. Adler was suddenly very interested in something behind the counter. Mrs. Wheeler, near the window, was looking at Hatch with an expression of calm assessment that did not suggest sympathy. Martin Fry had stopped pretending to cough. This valley, Hatch said, and then he stopped, and something in the stop told her he had decided this was not the ground he wanted to fight on. He picked up what he'd come for and went to the counter, and the transaction was brief, and he left. The room exhaled. Clara immediately took Cora's arm and said something in her ear, and Cora looked at her sister with the expression of someone receiving a compliment they aren't entirely sure was earned. Mrs. Wheeler came over and looked at Cora and said, Young lady, I hope you stay in this valley a good long time. It was possibly the warmest thing Edna Wheeler had said to anyone in recent memory, and the fact that she said it to an 8-year-old seemed to surprise even her. Martin Fry clapped Beatrice once on the shoulder as he passed, the way men do when words seem insufficient, and she understood it for what it was. She finished her list. Her hands were not entirely steady as she counted out the money for Adler, but they were steady enough. When she and the girls stepped out of the trading post into the bright morning, Clara said, Cora, you were terrifying. Cora considered this. I was just talking. That's what made it terrifying, Clara said. Beatrice looked at both of them, her daughters, her particular difficult, excellent daughters, and felt something large move through her that she didn't try to name. She put a hand on each of their heads briefly and said, Let's get home. Elias heard the story that evening from Martin Fry, who told it to him at the fence line with the particular relish of a man who has witnessed something that exceeded his expectations. He came in for supper with an expression Beatrice had not seen on him before, something between awe and laughter that he was trying to keep composed. He looked at Cora across the supper table and said, Cora. Cora looked up from her plate. Martin Fry says you told Gerald Hatch to say things to your face instead of around you. Cora put her fork down. I did. In front of most of the trading post. Yes. A pause. How did that feel? He asked, and it was a real question, not a rhetorical one, asked with genuine curiosity. Cora thought about it. My heart was going fast, she said, but I was angrier than I was scared, so it didn't matter much. Elias nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. That's about how it works. Clara looked at Elias with the expression of someone who has discovered a connection. Does your heart go fast when you're scared? Every time, he said. But you do it anyway? Usually, he said. Not always. Sometimes I should have, and I didn't. But usually. Clara absorbed this with the gravity she brought to all information she considered important. Cora picked her fork back up and returned to her food with the air of someone who had received what she needed from the exchange and was ready to move on. Beatrice watched all of this small, ordinary supper table conversation about fear and courage between a man who had spent years alone and 2 children who were still learning what they were made of. And she thought that there was no clean word for what was happening in this house. It wasn't rescue, because she had not been passive. It wasn't simply shelter, because shelter implied temporary. It was something that was still in the process of becoming what it was going to be, still unfinished and imperfect and unclear at the edges. But she thought, carefully, without letting herself lean on the thought too hard, that it was going to be something. After supper, Elias went out to check the animals, as he always did in the evening, and when he came back in, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her where she was washing the dishes and said without obvious preamble, "I went to see Hatch this afternoon." She turned. "What?" "Before supper, I rode to his place." He came in and sat at the table. "I told him that what happened at the trading post was the last time something like that happens. That if he has a grievance, he brings it to a formal process, or he brings it to me directly, but that using my family as the subject of public conversation is finished." She noticed the word, the same way she had noticed it the first time he'd used it without apparent intention, family. He said it the same way he said other plain and unadorned facts. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said I was making a mistake letting sentiment interfere with good sense." Elias looked at the table. "I told him that in my experience the things people called sentiment were usually just decency by another name, and that I was not particularly interested in a version of good sense that required me to be indecent." She stood with the dishcloth in her hands and looked at him. "You said that to Gerald Hatch." "I said it," he confirmed. He looked slightly surprised by himself in retrospect. She turned back to the dishes. She was smiling, and she didn't try to hide it, and she heard, behind her, the sound of Elias Thompson exhaling, long and slow, the way a man does when he has been holding something in for a while and finally sets it down. Outside, the night was coming on, slow and dark and vast, the way nights were out here, with no city light to soften the edge of it, and the stars when they came would be enormous and close. And somewhere at the edge of the property the grass moved in a wind that was cooling now that the sun was gone. The house held its sound, and in the morning there would be more to deal with. Hatch was not finished. Gerald Hatch was never simply finished. And there were other things coming that she could not yet see the shape of. But tonight the dishes got done, and the lamp stayed lit and the girls slept soundly in the back room. And that, for now, was everything. Hatch did not come back directly. That was the thing about men like him. They didn't repeat the same move twice when it failed publicly. They found the next angle, the next pressure point, the next thing that couldn't be traced back cleanly to their hand. Beatrice had understood this since the trading post, and she'd said as much to Elias, and Elias had agreed, and they had both been waiting without quite saying they were waiting. What came was not another rumor. What came was a letter. It arrived on a Wednesday, addressed to Elias, no return name on the envelope, the handwriting that of someone who had paid someone else to write it, or who was disguising their own. Elias read it at the kitchen table while Beatrice was outside with the girls, and when she came in, he was sitting with the letter flat in front of him and his hands on either side of it, and a stillness about him that she had come to recognize as the particular stillness of controlled anger. She looked at the letter, then at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He picked the letter up and read a section of it aloud, his voice flat. "It has come to the attention of several prominent landholders in the Coloma Valley that the Thompson Ranch has been operating under irregularities in its grazing boundary registrations, and that a formal review of the 1858 survey records may reveal discrepancies that could affect the validity of current land claims." Silence. "Is that true?" she said. "The boundary registrations." "There was a survey dispute in 1858, he said. "Samuel handled it. It was resolved. There are records at the county office." He set the letter down. "This is Hatch pulling up old ground because the committee vote didn't go his way. He can't come at us directly anymore, so he's going after the land." She sat down. She thought about it the way she tried to think about difficult things, not from the worst angle, but from the practical one. What would a formal review involve? Somebody from the county coming out to look at the survey markers, comparing them to the 1858 records. If the records are in order, and they should be, nothing comes of it. He paused. If somebody has tampered with the records or the markers before the review, it could be more complicated. She heard what he wasn't quite saying. "You think he'd do that?" Elias looked at the letter. "I think he's capable of it. I don't know if he'd go that far." He folded the letter and set it aside with the deliberate motion of someone putting a problem in its box while they decide how to deal with it. "I need to go to the county office. Look at the records myself before anyone else requests a review. See what's there." "When?" "Tomorrow." She thought. "Take the originals with you if you can, or get certified copies made. He looked at her. Why copies? Because if someone is going to tamper with records, they tamper with the ones in the office, not the ones you're holding. She said it matter-of-factly. William had a business partner who understood that principle very well, in the wrong direction. Something moved in Elias's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The look of a man who is revising his understanding of what someone knows. Your husband's partner. Former partner by the end. He altered 3 sets of accounts and nearly took the business down before William caught it. She folded her hands on the table. Get copies. Keep them somewhere that isn't the ranch. Give a set to Martin Fry if he'll hold them. Elias was quiet for a moment. You've dealt with this kind of thing before. Not land records, but men who use paperwork as a weapon. Yes. She met his eyes directly. It's the same principle. He nodded once, the nod of someone incorporating new information without making a performance of it. Martin will hold them, he said. He'll understand why. The next morning he rode to the county office and was gone most of the day. And Beatrice managed the ranch with the same practical attention she brought to everything and tried not to let the girls see that the waiting was harder than she wanted it to be. Cora spent the morning with the garden, which had come along considerably in the past weeks. The beans were climbing, the lettuce was full, the small kitchen garden that had been neglected for 2 seasons was beginning to look like something intentional again. Clara had taken to following the older ranch hand, a quiet man named Pete who came 3 days a week, and learning things from him that she reported back to Beatrice in the evenings with the thoroughness of someone filing a comprehensive account. That Wednesday she came in and said that Pete had shown her how to check a horse's hoof for stones and demonstrated the grip on Beatrice's wrist before Beatrice could decide whether she wanted to be demonstrated on. That's the pressure you use, Clara said, holding Beatrice's wrist with 2 fingers. Not too hard or they pull back. I'll remember that, Beatrice said. Pete says you have to make them trust you before you try to lift the foot. Otherwise, you're just fighting them. Pete is right, Beatrice said. And then, because it was true and Clara collected true things, that applies to more than horses. Clara considered this in the way she considered things that were clearly meant to carry extra meaning. Like people. Sometimes like people, Beatrice said. Clara nodded, filed it, went back outside. Elias came back in the late afternoon with 2 rolls of documents tied with string and the look of a man who has spent a day in a county office reading survey records, which was not a look of vitality. He ate supper with the focused efficiency of someone fueling rather than enjoying, and after the girls were in bed, he spread the documents on the kitchen table and walked Beatrice through what he'd found. The 1858 records were there and intact. The survey markers, as recorded, matched the current property lines within acceptable variance. There was a note in the file about the 1858 dispute, a disagreement with a neighboring property owner about the northwest corner, a man named Aldrich who had sold his land in 1861 and moved on. The dispute had been formally resolved in the county record. So the records are clean, she said. The records are clean, he confirmed. I got 2 certified copies. 1 is going to Martin tomorrow. 1 I'm keeping here. He looked at the documents. But I talked to the clerk at the county office while I was there. Asked him, casually, if anyone had been in recently inquiring about Thompson land records. She looked up. And? He said a man had come in about 10 days ago, asked to see the survey records for several properties in the valley, including this one. He paused. He described the man as heavy-set, wide mustache. She didn't need him to say the name. Hatch has already looked at the records, she said. And found them clean, Elias said, which is probably why the letter was vague. He looked, he didn't find what he needed, but he sent the letter anyway to see if the threat alone would do something. She thought about that, the calculation of it, the particular malice of threatening a formal review when you already know the records will clear, just to make the other person spend time and worry managing it. He wanted you frightened, she said, and occupied. Yes. That's actually useful information, she said. It means he doesn't have anything real. He's working with the threat of process because the process itself won't give him what he wants. Elias looked at her across the documents. You think like a tactician, he said. It was not a criticism. It was the tone of someone noting something they had observed several times and were now saying aloud. I think like a woman who had to figure out what was actually happening while a man with more authority than sense was telling her a different version of events, she said. It teaches you to look at the structure underneath the story. He was quiet for a moment. Samuel's letter said you were practical, he said. He wrote that specifically. I remembered it. She looked at the documents rather than at him. It still did something to her when he mentioned the letters, not pain exactly, but something that needed a moment to settle. He was generous in his assessment. He was usually accurate, Elias said. He wasn't a man who wasted words on things that weren't true. He began rolling the copies back up. I'll take one to Martin in the morning. Tell Martin what you told me, she said, about Hatch already having looked. Martin should know that Hatch is working from a position of having found nothing. I will. He tied the string around the roll, then, without looking up, Beatrice. She waited. I'm aware, he said slowly, that you've been managing a great deal of this. The Ruth Fry conversation, the suggestion about the copies, the way you read what Hatch is doing. He finished tying the string and set the roll down. I'm not used to having someone to think alongside. I want you to know that I know it's not nothing. She looked at him. This was as close as Elias Thompson got to an expression of gratitude for the kind of thing that was not easily categorized, not a task completed, not a specific favor, but the ongoing presence of another mind working in the same direction. She understood that for a man who had done everything alone for a long time, naming this at all cost him something. I know, she said. And then, I'm not used to it either. Someone to think alongside. She paused. It's better than thinking alone. He looked at her for a moment longer than he usually held eye contact. Then he picked up the document roll and stood. I'll be up early, he said. Martin's place first. I'll have coffee ready, she said. He went to bed. She sat at the table for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, the single lamp making its small, warm light, and she thought about what thinking alongside meant, about what it was built from, which was trust, and what trust was built from, which was time and evidence and the accumulated weight of small moments. She thought about how she had not expected to be here, in this specific place, building this specific thing. And she thought, carefully, and with her eyes open, that building it was not a consolation prize for the life she'd lost. It was its own thing, separate, worth the building. The next several weeks moved with the rhythm of a ranch in high summer. Long days, early mornings, work that was physical and immediate, and that did not pause for anyone's internal complications. The threat of Hatch's land review did not materialize into action. Martin Fry had made it quietly known among the committee that the survey records were clean and certified copies were being held, which effectively made any formal challenge an exercise in public embarrassment for whoever brought it. Gerald Hatch did not, apparently, want that particular embarrassment. What he did instead was withdraw. Not graciously, not with any acknowledgement that the situation had been resolved, but with the gradual sullen retraction of a man who has used up his immediate options and is waiting for a different angle to present itself. Beatrice had dealt with enough people of his type to know that withdrawal was not the same as acceptance. But it was quiet, and quiet was something. The ranch itself demanded attention regardless. The summer heat was serious, and the cattle needed moving to the higher pasture where the grass was less burned, which was several days of work. And Pete, the ranch hand's young nephew, came to help for the week and was 14 and earnest and followed Elias around with the particular devotion of a boy who has not had much to admire and is making up for it. Elias bore this without visible discomfort, which Beatrice found interesting, given how poorly he had initially managed two small girls asking him questions about everything. She mentioned this to Ruth Fry on one of Ruth's visits, and Ruth said, without looking up from her mending, "Boys are simpler. They want to know how to do things. Girls want to know why." "Is that bad?" Beatrice asked. "Lord, no," Ruth said. "It just takes more out of you." Clara, for her part, had developed a working relationship with Pete that was largely practical and mutually respectful. She had learned to water the horses properly, to muck a stall without complaint, and to identify by sound the difference between a cow that was simply unhappy and a cow that had a problem. Pete had told Elias that Clara had a good eye for the animals, which Elias had relayed to Beatrice with a straightforwardness that she suspected was its own form of pride, though he would not have called it that. Cora had made the garden her project in a way that was total and systematic. She had drawn a map of the beds on a piece of brown paper, actual measurements, actual notations of what was planted where, and she updated it when things changed and consulted it with the seriousness of someone managing a significant enterprise. Elias had looked at the map one evening when Cora left it on the table and studied it for a long moment without saying anything, and then he had said to Beatrice later quietly, "She drew it in 2-foot increments. Did you know that? She measured the beds." "I'm not surprised," Beatrice said. "She's 8, he said. Not criticism, something else. "She's always been like that," Beatrice said. "Even when she was small. She needed to understand the structure of things before she could be comfortable in them." He had nodded in the thoughtful way he nodded when he was placing new information into a larger picture. And she had thought, watching him, that he was learning her children the way she had learned to read the sounds of the ranch. Not formally, not with intention, but through accumulation, through daily proximity, through the slow accretion of specific knowledge that eventually becomes understanding. The conversation that changed things happened on a Sunday evening in late August, which arrived with a temperature drop and a sky that went from white to a particular deep blue that felt like a held breath before autumn. Elias had been quiet most of the day, in the way that was not unhappy, but internal, doing fence work, and then coming in for supper and talking normally enough, but with some part of him somewhere else. The girls were in bed. The kitchen was clean. Beatrice was at the table with the account book. She had taken over the monthly reconciliation without either of them formally deciding it, the same way she had taken over the bread, and he had taken over the morning horse watering schedule, things settling into place through practice rather than agreement. She heard him come back in from his last check of the evening. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and she looked up, and he had the look she associated with something he had been working toward saying. He sat down across from her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. Then, "When you wrote to Samuel, before you came, were you coming because you had no other choice or because you wanted to?" She set down the pencil. It was a more direct question than she had expected, and she gave it the honest attention it deserved. "Both," she said. "I don't think I would have considered it if I'd had more options. But once I was considering it, once I read his letters, I was coming because I wanted to. Because he seemed like a man worth trusting. Because I thought it might actually be good." She paused. "Why?" "Because I need to know the difference," he said, "between someone who is here because there's nowhere else and someone who—" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I've been thinking about asking you something for a few weeks, maybe longer, and I keep not asking because I don't want it to be the wrong question for the wrong reason." She understood what was being approached, and she felt the weight of it. Not dread, not exactly, but the gravity of a moment that is actual. "Say the question, Elias." He looked at her directly. "I would like you to consider staying, not as an arrangement, not because of the situation or what's practical. I'd like you to consider marrying me." He said it with the same quality he brought to most important things. Plainly, without embellishment, without making it smaller than it was by surrounding it with unnecessary words. "I know that this isn't what you planned for. I know it's not even what you came here expecting. And I know you might need more time, or more, whatever it is a person needs before they can answer that question honestly. I'm not asking for an answer tonight." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the account book open in front of her, the sound of the house around them, the sound she had learned so thoroughly by now that silence in this house felt different from silence anywhere else she had ever been. "Why?" she asked. It was the question that mattered. He didn't look away. "Because I come home to this house and it sounds different than it used to. Because your daughters argue about the garden map, and I find that I have opinions about who is right. Because when Hatch sent that letter, I was angry about the land for about 5 minutes, and then I was angry because I thought it might make you leave, which was a different kind of angry entirely." He stopped. "Because I tried to identify when I started thinking of you as family, and I couldn't find the specific moment, which I think means it happened gradually, and then it was just true. She sat with that for a moment. I'm not an easy person, she said. I have opinions about most things, and I'm not quiet about them. I have 2 children who are going to be exactly this much work for at least another 10 years and probably longer. I am not, she paused, choosing the words. I am not the woman I was before William died. I'm more careful with things now. It takes me longer to trust something. I don't know if I'm capable of being what you might have expected. I don't have an expectation, he said. I have what I've actually seen, which is who you actually are. That's what I'm asking about. She was quiet for what was probably a longer silence than he was comfortable with. She could see him sitting with it, not pressing, which was very him. The willingness to wait while things were being decided, the patience that looked like stillness, and was actually a very active form of respect. I don't need more time, she said finally. I've been thinking about it too. I've been thinking about it and trying not to think about it for the same reasons you were probably trying not to say it. She looked at him steadily. Yes. He looked at her. Just for a moment, something moved in his expression that was not his usual controlled, contained self. Something unguarded, something that had been under pressure and had just been released. Yes, she said again, because it was true, and true things were worth saying twice. He nodded once. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, on top of the account book, and his hand was large and work-roughened and warm, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that for a moment in the kitchen of the house that was becoming her house, in the life that was becoming her life. I should tell you, he said after a moment, that I have no idea how to do this. I've lived alone a long time. I know, she said. I've been watching you figure it out in real time for 2 months. That obvious? You explained how to work the stove to me in the 4th week, she said, after I had been using the stove for 4 weeks. He had the grace to look embarrassed. I didn't know how else to... I know, she said. It was endearing. Don't apologize for it. The embarrassment shifted into something that was, if not quite a smile, the most direct approach to one she had seen from him. I'll try to stop explaining things you already know. You probably won't entirely succeed, she said, but the effort will be appreciated. He laughed, short, real, and she thought that she had not yet gotten tired of that sound, which was still somewhat rare and therefore valuable, and which she suspected she would not get tired of for a very long time. They told the girls the next morning. Or rather, Beatrice told Clara, and Clara immediately turned to look at Cora with an expression that suggested this was information Cora had already processed in advance. Cora, for her part, looked at Elias with the direct assessing look she used on things she was adding to her map of the world, and then she said, Does that mean we can plant the fruit trees in the fall? Elias blinked. Yes, if you want fruit trees. You said last week there wasn't much point because the timing wasn't settled, Cora said. If it's settled now, the fall is when we should plant them. They'll have all winter to establish the roots. Elias looked at Beatrice with the expression of a man whose marriage proposal has been processed by an 8-year-old primarily as a gardening schedule update. She does that, Beatrice said. I can see that, he said. Can I name one? Clara said. The trees? Pete's horse has a name. The garden should have names too. Gardens don't usually have names, Elias said. This one will, Clara said, with the flat certainty of someone who has made a decision and is informing others of it rather than requesting approval. Elias looked at her for a moment. Then, all right, he said. You can name them. Clara looked satisfied. Cora was already drawing something on the corner of her brown paper map. It was not the moment Beatrice might have imagined, had she been imagining moments. It was too ordinary, too practical, too much about fruit trees and garden maps. But she had stopped, somewhere in the past months, trusting the imagined moments over the actual ones. The actual ones were always stranger and more specific, and when you sat with them long enough, more true. She looked at Elias, who was watching Cora draw with an expression that was trying and mostly failing to be neutral. He caught her looking and said, quietly, so only she heard it, The whole garden should have a name if she wants. It can be whatever she decides. Beatrice looked at him. This man, This particular difficult, decent man who had explained the stove to her in week 4 and had ridden to 3 properties before dawn on her behalf, and had told Gerald Hatch that decency and good sense were not opposites, and who was now prepared to let an 8-year-old name a fruit tree. And she thought that she did not have a word for the specific quality of what she felt, which was not the dizzying, consuming feeling she had read about and occasionally felt in youth, but something more durable than that, something that had a foundation under it, something she thought would hold through seasons. She thought that was better, actually. She turned back to her coffee. Outside, through the kitchen window, the garden that had been 2 seasons neglected and was now tended and mapping and growing showed the first real signs of what it was going to become. Not a symbol, not a metaphor, just a garden in the ground being cared for by people who intended to be around to see what it produced. That, too, was enough. They were married on a Saturday in early October, when the heat had finally broken and the mornings had that particular cool clarity that felt like the air had been rinsed clean overnight. The ceremony was at the Fry property, because Ruth had offered and Beatrice had accepted, and because the trading post where Cora had faced down Gerald Hatch seemed like the wrong kind of memory to attach to a wedding, even if it was also, in its way, a victory. It was not a large gathering. Martin and Ruth Fry, Joseph Fry and his wife, Old Davis, who came alone and ate more than anyone else, and said very little but shook Elias's hand at the end with both of his own, which Elias later said was the closest Davis came to a speech. Hosea Bright came with his wife, a small, steady woman named Margaret, who had come from Pennsylvania 30 years ago, as Ruth had said, and who took one look at Clara and Cora and said, "You two are going to be interesting adults," which Clara took as a compliment and Cora took as an observation, both of which were probably correct. Edna Wheeler from the boarding house came and wore a dress that suggested she had made an effort, and stood to one side with the posture of a woman who is not accustomed to celebrations, but is making her best attempt at one. Pete the ranch hand came, which Beatrice had not expected, but which moved her more than she anticipated. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and looked at the ground during most of the ceremony and shook both their hands afterward and said, "Good," with the compression of a man for whom that word was doing significant work, and then went and stood by the food table. There was a justice of the peace from town, a man named Calhoun, who did these things with the practiced neutrality of someone who had married enough couples to understand that the ceremony was for them and not for him, and who said the words at a pace that was neither rushed nor drawn out, which was exactly what was needed. Elias stood beside her with his good coat and his cleaned boots and his jaw shaved clean for the first time in what she realized was several weeks, and he said the words when they were required of him in the same voice he used for all important things, level, unhurried, meaning every syllable without needing to announce that he meant them. When it was done, Clara cried, which surprised everyone, including Clara, who covered it immediately with an expression of determined composure that convinced no one. Cora did not cry. Cora watched the whole proceeding with her usual careful attention, and afterward came and stood beside Elias, and without any preamble whatsoever took his hand, the way a small person takes the hand of someone they have decided to trust, matter-of-factly, without making a ceremony of it. Elias looked down at her hand in his, and then at Beatrice, and his expression had that quality it sometimes had, trying to be contained and not entirely succeeding. Ruth Fry, standing nearby, said quietly to Beatrice, "That child does everything on her own schedule, and when she decides completely." "Yes," Beatrice said, "she does." It was not a perfect day. The food ran slightly short because more people had come than Ruth had planned for, and there was a period of reorganization that was a little undignified, and Old Davis spilled his drink and was embarrassed about it, and Clara at one point got into a disagreement with Joseph Fry's youngest son about something that was never fully explained and required brief maternal intervention. The sky clouded over in the afternoon, and there was talk of rain that didn't come, which left everything feeling slightly suspended for a while. But the imperfections were the kind that meant the day was real. And at the end of it, driving back to the ranch in the last of the October light, with Clara asleep against her shoulder, and Cora sitting upright and awake with her hands folded in her lap as if she were managing a very important piece of cargo, Beatrice thought that she had been to a wedding before. Her own, the first one, in a church in Ohio with flowers and a proper dress and 25 guests. And this had been nothing like that. And she was not sorry for the difference. She was not replacing the first life with the second. She was living the second because the first had ended, and the second was real, and hers, and she intended to be in it fully. Elias drove without speaking, which was normal, and at one point he put his hand briefly over hers on the seat between them, and then took it back to the reins. And that too was normal, and was enough. The winter came in hard that year, harder than the previous one according to Pete, who had the long memory for weather that men who worked outside accumulated like scar tissue. The first real snow arrived in November, and the cattle had to be brought in early, and there were 2 weeks in December where the cold was serious enough that the water troughs froze each morning and had to be broken before the animals could drink. And Elias was up before first light every day doing it, and Beatrice was up not long after starting the stove and the coffee and making sure there was something warm by the time he came back in, because that was the structure they had found. Not discussed and assigned, but arrived at through the simple logic of who was where and what needed doing. Clara, who had spent the fall learning the outdoor work, discovered that her tolerance for serious cold was not what she had believed it to be. This was a significant blow to her self-image, and she dealt with it by increasing the indoor work to compensate, which meant the household ran with unusual efficiency for the duration of the worst of the winter, which Beatrice accepted without comment. You took the silver linings where they appeared. Cora had planted 3 fruit trees in the fall, as planned. 2 apple, 1 pear, in the southeast corner of the property where the drainage was good, which Elias had helped her assess with a seriousness that matched her own. They were bare sticks now in the frozen ground. Cora went to look at them every few days with the expression of someone monitoring an investment, and would come back in and report, to no one in particular, that they were fine. "How can you tell?" Clara asked once. "The bark," Cora said. "You can see if it's damaged. You're standing 10 feet away." "I know what I'm looking at," Cora said, and that was the end of the discussion. It was during those winter months that Elias and the girls found their actual footing with each other, the kind that doesn't come from a moment or a decision, but from shared time in enclosed space. He taught Clara to play chess on the board that had been his father's, which had been in the house so long it had become part of the furniture, and Clara was terrible at first and furious about being terrible, and then gradually less terrible and furious about that in a different way. The fury of someone who is improving and cannot stand the implication that they still have further to go. He lost to her for the first time in February, and she looked at him with flat suspicion and said, "Did you let me win?" "No," he said. "You'd tell me if you did?" "I'd tell you," he said. "Letting you win would defeat the purpose." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "Okay," and began resetting the board for another game. With Cora, the relationship was quieter and in its way deeper. He started pointing things out to her when they were outside together. Not teaching exactly, not the way he taught Clara chess with explicit instruction, but showing. The way the ground changed texture near the northeast fence where there was clay beneath the topsoil. The direction the deer moved in from the tree line in early morning. The specific sound the wind made through the gap in the barn wall that needed sealing before spring. Cora absorbed these things in silence, and then, sometimes days later, would say something that demonstrated she had been turning the observation over, looking at all sides of it. He learned over the winter to wait for those delayed responses. They were worth waiting for. Beatrice watched all of this and felt something that she did not try to categorize too precisely. Something that was gratitude, and also something more complicated than gratitude. Something that had to do with the understanding that good things were not given but made. That the life she was in had not happened to her, but had been built, imperfectly and incrementally, by people choosing to build it day after day in the middle of all the other things that were also happening. Gerald Hatch made one more move. She had expected it, and it came in January, when the cold had a way of making small irritations feel larger, and the distance between properties made everything feel more isolated. What he did was approach Leonard Kell, who had voted with him in the fall and owed him a degree of social loyalty because of it, and suggest that a formal petition be made to the county regarding the Thompson grazing rights in the North Pasture, where the property boundary touched a stretch of county land that had never been clearly allocated. It was a different angle than the survey records. It was also, as Beatrice understood when Elias explained it, potentially more complicated, because the county land question was genuinely unsettled, not the result of tampering, but of old ambiguity in the original land grants. Elias told her about it on a Tuesday evening with the careful manner he had when he was not certain how to present a problem, not hiding it from her. Never that, but making sure he understood it himself before he brought it. They sat at the kitchen table with the account book between them, which had become their shorthand for practical discussions. The book is a kind of anchor point. What does it actually affect, she asked, if the county allocates that strip to someone else? We lose about 40 acres of grazing. It's not catastrophic, but it puts pressure on the summer rotation. He looked at the table. It's also not nothing. How long has the boundary been used as it currently is? Since the original claim, 18 years. Is there documentation of the use? Cattle records? Anything that shows continuous use of that pasture? He looked at her. There are cattle records going back to when my father had the ranch. Then you have an adverse use argument, she said. 18 years of documented continuous use of the land creates a claim independent of the original survey ambiguity. It's not guaranteed, but it's solid. She paused. You'd need to make the argument to the county land office, with the records. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know about adverse use? My father had a property dispute with a neighbor when I was 12, she said. It lasted 4 years and I grew up listening to it. I absorbed more land law than any child should have to. She folded her hands. You need to file before Hatch's petition is formally accepted. If you file first with the use documentation, you're the responding party with evidence rather than the challenged party defending against an allegation. He looked at her with the expression he sometimes had, that she had come to understand was not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, revising the picture he had of a situation in light of something he hadn't anticipated. I'll ride to the county office this week, he said. Take the cattle records from the last 10 years minimum, she said, and anything with your father's name on it from before that. If you have receipts from that pasture, fence repair records, anything that places activity there in a documented way. He nodded, absorbing it. Then, Beatrice. She looked up. I would have fought this eventually, he said. But I would have fought it slower and from the wrong position. She held his look. You would have figured it out, she said. It just would have taken longer. Maybe, he said, but you being here makes me faster. He said it with the same plain quality he used for other true things, not as a compliment seeking a response, but as a fact being stated accurately. I want you to know I know that. She thought about what it meant to be known, really known, not the version of you that other people carried around for their own purposes, but the actual one, the one that included the parts that were not particularly soft or easy. She had been known that way before, by William, but it had taken years of ordinary life to build, and she had thought, when he died, that she had lost the capacity to be known again in that particular complete way. She had thought it would take too long, and she had too little of whatever it cost to let someone see that much again. She had been wrong about that. It had cost less than she'd thought, and given more than she'd expected, and she was aware that this was the kind of realization you couldn't have until you were already inside it. I know you know it, she said, and then, I'll help you organize the records tomorrow. We can sort them by year and then by location. He nodded. Business done, the way they often did things. The feeling stated, received, and then returned to the practical world that was always waiting. She found she preferred this to the alternative. It was sustainable. It was real. Elias filed at the county office on a Thursday. Martin Fry went with him, not as a legal representative, but as a witness and a presence, because Martin understood that appearances at county offices were sometimes about more than paperwork. The clerk who had told Elias about Hatch's earlier records inspection was there, and he looked at the filing with the expression of a man who was relieved that the more organized party had arrived first. Hatch's petition was received 2 days later, and when the clerk compared it to the existing filing, Hatch's case looked exactly like what it was, a challenge to a use right that had already been documented and filed. The county land agent, a thorough man named Prescott, who had no particular stake in valley politics and considerable experience with exactly this type of dispute, reviewed both filings over the following 2 weeks and sent a written determination that the Thompson Ranch's documented continuous use of the North Pasture for 18 years constituted a recognized use right that superseded the unresolved survey ambiguity, and that no reallocation would be made. Martin Fry brought the determination to the ranch on a February afternoon, arriving with snow on his coat and a look on his face that was as close to triumphant as Martin Fry allowed himself. He handed the document to Elias. Elias read it, handed it to Beatrice. She read it and set it on the table. "Hatch is out of moves," Martin said. "He's used the committee, he's used rumors, he's tried the survey records, and now he's tried the county land office. He doesn't have anything left that has any chance of working." "Men like him find new angles," Beatrice said. She believed this. She had believed it all along. "They do," Martin agreed, "but they also have reputations to manage. He's made 3 formal or semi-formal challenges against Elias in the past 6 months and lost all 3. People are watching. Even the men who voted with him are getting tired of backing a losing proposition." He paused. "I'm not saying he's finished. I'm saying his radius has gotten smaller." That was accurate, and she knew it. Hatch would not stop being who he was. He would not experience a change of character or a moment of reckoning that made him a different person. She had let go of any expectation of that early on. What happened instead was the more ordinary and less satisfying but ultimately more stable outcome. The community around him had, through accumulated evidence, stopped finding it useful to be aligned with him. Not because they had become more just, but because he had become a liability. And people in small communities made those calculations continuously, whether they acknowledged it or not. It was not a redemption story. It was a containment story. She was at peace with that. Geset. The apple trees showed their first buds in March, earlier than Cora had predicted, and this was taken as a significant event. Cora was outside early the morning she noticed, and came in to report with the contained excitement she brought to the confirmation of a hypothesis she'd been maintaining through months of evidence gathering, and Elias went out and looked at the trees with her, and agreed that yes, those were buds, and then they stood in the cold March morning looking at 2 sticks in the ground that were doing something so small it was almost invisible, and it was somehow one of the more quietly significant moments Beatrice could remember. She was at the window watching them. Elias's height, Cora's smallness beside him, both of them looking at the same trees with the same quality of attention. And she felt something happen in her chest that was not dramatic, not a revelation, just the quiet internal registering of a thing that was true. This was her life. These people were her family. Not the family she had been born into, not the family she had built the first time, but this one, chosen, assembled from wreckage and circumstance, and the specific stubbornness of people who refused to be only what had happened to them. Clara appeared at her elbow and looked out the window. "He's going to let her tell him the whole theory about why they budded early," Clara said. "Yes," Beatrice said. "He doesn't care about the theory. He'll listen anyway." "Yes," Beatrice said again. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Papa used to do that," she said. "Listen to things he didn't need to know because we wanted to say them." She said it without the weight it would have carried 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago. She said it the way you say something that is true and sad, and also simply part of the world as it is. "Yes," Beatrice said, for the 3rd time, because yes was the right word, and there wasn't a better one. Clara leaned against her. Not dramatically, just shifted her weight until she was resting against Beatrice's side, which she had started doing again in the winter, and which Beatrice had said nothing about, because there was nothing to say. A 12-year-old, she would be 9 in April, not 12, but she seemed older than she was, had seemed older than she was since William died. A 9-year-old who was also carrying something heavy needed somewhere to rest it. You didn't comment on that. You just made yourself available to lean on. Outside, Cora was still talking. Elias was still listening. Spring came properly in April, and the ranch came alive with it in the way that working land does. Not beautifully, not dramatically, but with the relentless productive urgency of a place that has been waiting for the season to change and is now getting on with it. The cattle came back from the sheltered winter pastures. The garden that had been dormant since November began showing green. Pete came back from his winter in town and looked at Clara's increased competence with the animals with the assessment of someone who had expected progress, and was finding it had exceeded expectations. "She's got away with the mare," he he told Elias. I know, Elias said. Better than most twice her age. Elias considered this. Don't tell her that yet. She'll stop listening if she thinks she knows enough. Pete looked at him. You'd have made a decent father, he said. It was not a complicated observation. It was the kind of thing Pete said, direct, unembroidered, carrying exactly what it meant and nothing extra. Elias was quiet for a moment. I'm trying, he said. Pete nodded. That's most of it, he said, and went back to work. The truth was that Elias was trying, and the truth was also that trying looked different than he'd expected it to. He had thought in the abstract that being responsible for children would feel like a weight, like a constraint, like the addition of obligation on top of obligation. What it actually felt like was closer to purpose, not always comfortable purpose. Purpose that occasionally asked things of him he didn't have ready and had to find quickly, that required him to be patient when he was tired and consistent when he was distracted and present in a way that left no room for the internal withdrawal he had used for years as his primary coping mechanism. He said some of this to Beatrice one evening, haltingly, the way he said most things that mattered, not flowingly, but in the careful progression of a man laying down one true stone at a time and checking it before he placed the next. He said that he had not expected it to feel like this, meaning the whole thing, the children and the house, and the dailiness of it. And she listened, and when he was done, she said, "What did you expect it to feel like?" He thought about it honestly. Like I was doing the right thing, he said, like a duty I had accepted. I expected to feel good about doing it, and also tired. And instead? Instead, I feel like I'm in the middle of something, he said. Something that has me in it, not something I'm managing from outside. She looked at him. That's what family feels like, she said, from the inside. He sat with that. I didn't know, he said. I didn't have a reference for it. Most people don't, she said, until they're in it. It was not a perfectly resolved conversation. There were things in it that didn't have clean conclusions, questions that were still open, feelings that had been gestured toward but not fully articulated. That was all right. She had stopped expecting clean conclusions from the important conversations. The important conversations circled and returned and built on each other over years, and what mattered was not finishing them, but continuing them. In May, two things happened that had no direct connection to each other, and yet seemed, in retrospect, to belong to the same moment in the story of the Thompson Ranch. The first was that Gerald Hatch put his property up for sale. No announcement, no explanation. The notice appeared at the county office and at the trading post on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday it was known throughout the valley. Leonard Kell told Martin Fry that Hatch had been struggling with his East Pasture water rights for 2 seasons, and the failed petitions had apparently cost him more in legal fees than he'd anticipated, and that the combination had made the valley less hospitable than it had been. Martin Fry told Elias with a neutrality that covered something close to satisfaction. Elias told Beatrice with the same neutrality. She did not feel victorious. She had understood months ago that she was not going to feel victorious when this ended, because what she had been fighting for was not Hatch's defeat, but her family's stability, and those were different things with different feelings attached. What she felt was something more like the way you feel when a persistent noise finally stops. Not joy exactly, but the relief of its absence, and then a kind of quiet in which you could hear the other things again. He was always going to do this eventually, she said. The kind of man who uses all his ammunition on one fight doesn't have anything left for the next one. Maybe, Elias said, or maybe he just decided this valley wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Same thing, she said. The second thing that happened in May was that Cora's apple trees flowered. It was not unexpected. The buds had been building since March, and Cora had been tracking the progress with her usual systematic attention. But the actual flowers, when they came, were enough of them and white enough and dense enough on the small trees that they made the southeast corner of the property look, for about 2 weeks, like something out of a story. Cora did not call them beautiful. She called them successful, which was her version of the same thing. Clara named them. The larger apple tree she named William, which she announced without drama, at supper one evening, and which no one commented on because no comment was needed. The smaller apple she named Ruth, after Ruth Fry, which Ruth found out about and responded to by bringing a jar of her preserved peaches to the ranch and leaving them on the step with a note that said, "Only very sensible." The pear tree Cora named herself quietly, without announcing it. She wrote the name on the corner of her map in small letters. The name was Elias. She never said she'd done it. Beatrice saw it on the map months later and said nothing to anyone, and kept it the way you keep the things that are most true, privately, carefully, with full knowledge of what they mean. By summer, the ranch was running better than it had in years, which was partly the season and partly the cattle, and partly the fact that Beatrice's management of the accounts had found two areas of consistent inefficiency in the supply purchasing that, once corrected, made a meaningful difference to the margin. Elias had looked at her corrections and said, with the flat, honest acknowledgement he was capable of, "I've been overpaying that supplier for 6 years." "You were paying what they asked," she said. "You just didn't have anyone to compare it against. You compared it." "I had time in February when there wasn't much else to do," she said, which was partially true and partially modest, and he knew the difference. What he said next was not something he planned. It arrived the way things did with him, as a straightforward statement of something he had apparently decided internally and was now reporting. "When Martin retires from the committee, I think you should put your name forward." She looked at him. "For the Valley Committee." "You know more about how it works than half the men on it," he said. "You know what Hatch used it for and how to prevent it. You know land law and you know accounts, and you know how to read what people are actually doing versus what they're saying they're doing." He paused. "Martin's been talking about stepping back. He mentioned it last month." "I'm a woman," she said. "The bylaws don't say anything about that," he said. Martin checked. Apparently it never occurred to whoever wrote them that it would come up. She was quiet for a moment, turning it over. The part of her that was pragmatic noted that there had been a committee vote in her favor, and a county filing in her favor, and a community of people who had, over the past year, revised their initial uncertainty into something closer to respect. The part of her that was realistic noted that none of that made the path easy, and that easy had stopped being the standard she applied to things a long time ago. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm saying," he said. She thought about it for 3 weeks and then told Martin Fry. And Martin said, "I was wondering when someone would get around to asking you," which was Martin's way of indicating he had been thinking about this for longer than 3 weeks himself. She did not put her name forward that year. She put it forward the following spring, when Martin formally retired from the committee, and she was elected 4 votes to 2, with the 2 dissenting votes coming from men who were not unfair, but who needed more time, and who came around eventually, in the way that people who are not fundamentally unreasonable come around when they see enough evidence. There is a particular quality to a life that has been rebuilt rather than simply lived, a texture to it, a density, that comes from having known the alternative. Beatrice Thompson, who had been Beatrice Whitmore, who had stood on a platform in Coloma with 2 children and a worn suitcase, and the specific grief of someone whose plan had just failed completely, understood this in a way that she could not have understood when she was younger and her life had not yet broken and been remade. She understood that the rebuilt thing was not lesser than what had been lost. She understood that it was different, shaped by different forces, fitted to different contours, and that the shaping was not a consolation but a fact, and that facts could be good or not good regardless of how they had arrived. She understood that the people you chose, when you had the freedom to choose, were not the same as the people you were born to, or the people you had found in the original unbroken version of your life, but that chosen people could be true in their own way, could hold their own weight, could become, over time, as necessary as breath. She understood that Elias Thompson was not a simple man, and that she had not wanted a simple man, had in fact spent years with the specific kind of complexity he carried, the kind that came from loss and solitude and the discipline of surviving both without losing the capacity for honesty, and that recognizing what you needed was not the same as knowing you would find it, and that finding it was not the same as being given it, and that she had helped build this as much as she had fallen into it, and that both things were true simultaneously. She understood that Clara, who was 10 now and furious at increasingly sophisticated things, was going to be someone worth knowing in 20 years, and that the fury was not the problem, but the fuel. She understood that Cora, who had named a pear tree after a man she had chosen to trust without explanation or ceremony, was going to see the world more clearly than most people ever managed, and that the world would not always be comfortable with that, and that Cora would manage anyway. She understood that Pete's assessment, that Elias would have made a decent father, was both true and insufficient, because Elias was not making a decent attempt at fatherhood. He was doing it, imperfectly and earnestly and without a model to work from, and imperfect, earnest things done consistently over time were what most good things were made of. One evening in the late summer of their second year, she was in the kitchen, and Elias was in the kitchen, and the girls were outside in the last light, and she heard Clara explain something to Cora about the chess move she had been practicing, and heard Cora's response, which was short and accurate and deflating in the specific way Cora could be, and heard Clara's indignant reply, and heard the whole small argument resolve into silence, and then into the sound of them continuing to play. And she looked at Elias across the kitchen, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said, because this was just the sound of the life they were in, ordinary and irreplaceable, and entirely theirs. It was not the life she had planned. It was not the life she had imagined or asked for or seen coming. It had arrived sideways, through grief and failed plans and a stranger's unexpected decency, and it had required her to be harder and more patient and more stubborn than she had known she was. And it had given her in return something she had not known how to name when she was young and had not been sure she still deserved when she was standing on that platform with everything she owned in one bag. What it had given her was this kitchen, this man, these children, this particular Tuesday in late summer with the light coming through the window and the apple trees out in the southeast corner carrying their first real fruit, and the pear tree that Cora had named for Elias standing steady in the ground, establishing its roots, getting ready to last. What she had learned, the thing she would not have been able to say at the beginning and could say plainly now, was that belonging was not a place you found. It was a thing you built out of the materials that were actually in front of you, with the people who were actually there, in the life you were actually living rather than the one you had planned on. You built it badly sometimes. You built it slowly, always. You built it with arguments and misunderstandings and the specific difficulty of two people trying to share space and decisions and a future without ever fully knowing what they were doing. But you built it. And if you were lucky, not lucky in the way of being spared difficulty, but lucky in the deeper way, the way that had to do with what you were made of and who you had beside you, what you built held. Outside, the girls had stopped arguing about chess. The light was going golden and long across the land, the kind of light that made everything look like it was worth keeping, and the trees stood in it, and the cattle moved at the edge of the pasture, and the ranch that had been one man's solitary holding was something else now, something larger and louder and more complicated and more alive. Elias put his hand on the small of her back as he passed behind her toward the door, a brief and ordinary touch, the kind you give when you have given up needing to make gestures significant because the life itself has become significant enough. She leaned into it just slightly for just a moment. Then she went back to what she was doing, and the evening came on, and the stars appeared one at a time in the darkening sky above the California hills, and the Thompson Ranch settled into the night with all its people in it, imperfect and unfinished and entirely, stubbornly, irreversibly home.
I think there's just exactly what Ocean was saying. You got to match energy, of course, to some extent, but also it's like, I don't want to obviously I don't want to crush someone's hand either. But like if a guy tries to one up me with firmness in the handshake, I'm like, dude, I'm not here for you. I'm just I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk to you at all. Like you're a dick. That's what I'm gonna think. I'm gonna think you're a fucking dick. And I don't want to be your friend. I think you're not a good person at that point. And I'm not saying that that's that first impression is going to last. No, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that first impression of a person